Good morning. How's everybody doing today? We got a hello? Yeah? How about a round of applause? Okay. Welcome to the third annual Leadership and Social Justice Conference hosted here at UC Berkeley. My name is Caleb Westberg. I'm a second-year Bonner with AmeriCorps.
And my name is Marisol Esparza. I go to the University of San Francisco, and I'm a course-based advocate for community engagement through the Leo McCarthy Center.
So, my own personal story. The first issue that got me thinking about social justice was gay rights. As a straight man, I'm an LGBTQ ally, and growing up with gay parents has taught me different ways to think about the world. As a child, I didn't think there was anything to our queer family. It just was. When I introduced my parents to my kindergarten teacher, I began, "This is my mom, this is my dad, and this is my Katie." Let's say I just learned not to question love. I discovered, though, that it wasn't cool to tell kids my parents were queer. I experienced the prejudice that misunderstandings and arbitrary distinctions can bring. Having gay parents has been a wonderful thing, though. I've learned different ways to think about family. The difference is not bad, and that the world can change for the better. When I was growing up, my family and I, we participated in events to raise awareness of violence against women, the abuse of undocumented workers, animal rights, and a variety of other issues. I learned the value of community and my role within it. Now, today, as a former transfer student, my community has largely been community college students. And when I transferred to UC Berkeley, I founded the Berkeley City College Service Community. The program brings UC Berkeley students and Berkeley City College students together in civic engagement and leadership development with the theme of transferring. The current state of public education today is such that of the three levels, UCs, CSUs, and community colleges, the group with the most students receives the least amount of funding. Underfunded and understaffed student services make it difficult for students to engage. They're not given the opportunity for action with passion. My work with the BCC service community is to bring the myriad of resources and opportunities we have here at this institution to community colleges. Now, of course, I didn't expect to be a transfer student. I didn't even expect to be a community college student. It just happened that way. And the group of people that I found at Berkeley City College became my community. Author Maxine Hong Kingston once wrote, "Do the right thing by whoever crosses your path. Those incidental people are your people." Our conference theme this year is moving from passion to action. And I don't actually think that means enough for what we do already, because we are all already acting beings. That's how we got to be at these outstanding universities. In fact, being in this room today is a testament to your action. And I think that as we move throughout the conference today and take what we learn here back to our own universities, back to our own incidental people, let your passions transform your action. Indeed, that's how they become meaningful. Thank you.
Growing up in Oakland, I have always been aware of my parents' immigration status, but it had never been a problem. More than half the kids at my school had parents like mine who didn't have papers. However, all that began to change in 2005. Now it was a problem. The fact that my parents and many others like my parents didn't have papers termed them illegal aliens. There was raids and checkpoints at schools, workplaces, and restaurants. Families were being split apart. However, I wasn't too worried, because for years my mom had a lawyer who was supposedly helping her to become a legal resident of the United States. But on February 26, 2006, my mother was deported. I was so angry and afraid, angry at what had happened, angry at the lawyer for failing us, and angry at the government for criminalizing my mother, putting her in jail, and deporting her without us even being able to say goodbye. My anger turned into fear. Fear for my father. Was that going to happen to him next? What about my brother and I? We were born in the United States. Our whole lives were here. Would our parents' birthplace determine the rest of our lives? This anger and fear motivated me into action. At first, I just began to listen to the news, and then I did research on the topic. Was there anything that I could do about it? Why was this happening? I, in turn, gave the issue over of immigration to a group at my school, and we participated in the May 1st March in 2006 to support immigration reform. I then became involved in community groups, such as East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, which is right across the street. I worked with immigrants who were seeking asylum in the United States. I also worked at Catholic Worker in Oakland, where I helped with ESL classes and distributed food to recent immigrants. Furthermore, I participated in interviews and publications that would be sent to Barbara Boxer. This helped me to see the role that research can play in politics and government. At USF, I was part of service learning through an ethics course where I participated in a union for hotel and restaurant workers who were mainly immigrants fighting for their rights in the workplace. All of these avenues only opened up after I became knowledgeable about the issue that I was passionate about. And I believe that that is the first step in moving from passion to action. It is not only important to know your passion, its effects, its history, but also to know the reasons why people may support or be opposed to the issue that you care about. Like Caleb said, just by being here today, we are already moving from passion to action. However, that is not enough. I challenge you to be open to those perspectives that may be hard to listen to because they are different from your own. I challenge you to become aware and to learn about issues that you haven't previously focused on. Because if you haven't noticed, many issues are connected because they have many of the same causes to the injustices we see and experience today. I leave you to think and to use the information that you are given today by the speakers and the workshops to identify what is your next step in moving from passion to action. Thank you. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. She's a senior communication and women's studies major at St. Mary's College of California. She has been involved with the Associated Student Government for 4 years and is the current student body president. She has also been a Bonner leader at SMC for the last 2 years. She is passionate about women's rights, city politics, and food and environmental justice. Let's give a warm welcome to Damaris Nielsen.
That's a tough act to follow. Thank you so much for being here today. It is with great privilege that I introduce one of our keynote speakers, Brahm Ahmadi. Brahm is an advocate, organizer, and social entrepreneur working to build healthier and more equitable inner-city communities by creating meaningful change and innovation to critical facets of the food system. In 2003, Brahm co-founded People's Grocery, a nonprofit organization that has attracted local and national attention for its effort to transform inner-city food systems. A suite of projects in food enterprise, urban agriculture, nutrition education, and youth development that includes the nation's first mobile market. In 2010, he founded People's Community Market to create a food retail business model that is designed for and dedicated to health and well-being of low-income communities. In parallel to developing a retail store, Brahm is developing a number of online sources to support grocers in making a greater impact of the health and social needs of lower-income communities. Among issues of food justice, Brahm has also served in other social issues. Brahm has spoken at many universities and conferences and has been featured in media such as Newsweek, People magazine, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He He has a BA in sociology from the University of California and an MBA from the Presidio School of Management. After meeting Brahm this morning, it was such a privilege to hear someone who's so passionate about social justice and service, and it only inspires me in my efforts to create a just world. And it is without further ado that I give you Brahm Ahmadi.
Good morning. Wow, yeah, the bar is now set very high for spokesmanship, especially Caleb, Marisol, thank you for your stories. I'm going to do my best to follow those acts and share with you a little bit of my own experience today. I am by no means a professional speaker, and I am by no means an expert or researcher in the field of leadership. I am simply one who's out living it, doing it every single day with my passion and my desire to see meaningful change in the world. And that's why I've done what I've done for my entire adult life. So first of all, I just want to say it's really great to be here. This is so inspiring to look around and see all of you showing up on a kind of lazy, overcast Sunday morning at a conference about leadership and social justice. That in and of itself to me is a really, really inspiring fact. And gives me a lot of hope in this gathering itself. I also think this is a really auspicious day to have a conference like this, or time. One, of course, is, some of you probably know, this morning was the unveiling of the Martin Luther King Memorial, the dedication on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And of course, we're here in the Martin Luther King Student Union at UC Berkeley. So that is, I think, an important opportunity. Of course, we can thank a hurricane for rescheduling the opening of the dedication. But the fact of the matter is that Martin Luther King is a continuous inspiration, iconic figure for the movements of civil rights, for the movements of social justice. And I think it is very timely and auspicious to be having this conversation with the inspiration of such leaders as himself. At the same time, we are also looking at, in this day and age, a very different form of leadership. And right now, very visibly seeing that form of leadership, particularly in the Arab Spring uprisings that are happening in the Middle East and North Africa, and now here in the United States with the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy the central plazas of cities and small towns, including in rural areas, all across the United States, and as of yesterday, in Europe as well. What's significant about these particular movements is that they are, by and large, leaderless by our general conventional definitions of what leaders are. So the monolithic, iconic, heroic, all-knowing leader that is at the forefront is not what we're seeing in these movements. What we're seeing is a diffused, decentralized, shared form of leadership that is driven primarily by people's true passion and desire to see fundamental change in the communities of which they're a part of the people they care about, of their families, of their loved ones, of their residents. That is what now is driving leadership. And what we're seeing, especially in this day and age, where we each individually have so much more resources and capabilities available to us, especially in technology, a single individual can truly, truly move so much more change than at the time of Martin Luther King. At that time, the ability to communicate across broad populations was very difficult, virtually impossible, relative to not only our ability to reach across the globe, but to do it in real time and to do it immediately. That completely transforms what social justice movements can look like, how quickly they can act, how quickly they can rally. Just look at how quickly this Occupy Wall Street has actually come to become a reality. In a matter of, what, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the most, it's gone from a relatively small group of people protesting at Wall Street in New York to within several weeks, that happening all over the country. I saw a map of it the other day of the United States, and it was amazing how many red dots were on that map of where action is taking place. And no one is being told what to do. There is no leader that's saying, here's the strategy, we're leading the charge this way. It is collective groups of individuals, common, good people who are coming together to do this. And I think this is a very poignant moment in our society, a turning point really globally for us, where we are beginning to realize as common people that the model of leadership among our political leaders, our corporate leaders, is failing us. That those leaders are often simply too entrenched in the status quo, that they benefit too much from maintaining that status quo, and also lack the vision, the courage, and the ingenuity to drive forward new, bold solutions for change, because we are facing more complex social, political, and economic problems than we probably ever have as a society and as a globe. And based on that larger environmental circumstance of the complexity and sophistication of these issues, there no longer is a model of individual leadership that can solve these problems. And that's a key message that I want to make sure you all walk out with. We are all extraordinary individual leaders, but our leadership only can be effective in the context of shared action together. Even Martin Luther King understood this because, of course, even though he was an iconic figure in the civil rights movement and is often credited as being the main driver and visionary and symbol of that movement, there was a vast number of leaders behind him whose shoulders he stood upon, who did a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the work to even make Martin Luther King possible as a leader in our society. Martin Luther King once said, "Everything we see is a shadow cast by that which we don't see." And he was speaking of his own leadership. This desire within our particularly Western society to invest the power in particular individuals, he was trying to push back against, to enable us to understand that, in fact, leadership is in all of us, that the iconic leader is not the fundamental way of creating change. And this is particularly true in the context of social justice. Because what is social justice fundamentally about? It is about creating meaningful, transformative change amongst the most marginalized peoples and communities of our nation and our world. And its goal is to advance empowerment, to uplift the voices of those communities. And thus, the leadership model has to fundamentally reflect that agenda. Leaders cannot effectively speak for communities. They must speak with them and ultimately enable those communities to speak for themselves. And the reason I share that with you is that has been a philosophy that I came to learn when I was very young, actually in high school, when I started getting involved in activism, and have maintained consistently in my approach in both community organizing, social justice work, and leadership. So real quickly on my background before I kind of jump into some thoughts that I want to share about leadership, particularly in the context of social justice and that intersection between them. I was born in Iran, came to the United States when I was 6 years old. My family fled the new Islamic regime that was there after that regime seized our business and our properties. And because we left so quickly, we pretty much lost all of our valuable assets and had to hurry out of the country. Where we went was to my mother's parents' farm in southern Iowa on the Missouri border. Okay, radical change. I was born in Tehran in the Middle East. Suddenly, I'm in the heartland of white America on a farm in southern Iowa. And my dad likes to joke. My mother's a white American from Iowa, and my father obviously is Iranian. My dad likes to joke that I'm what happens when the Middle East and the Midwest get together, right? And so these were some very early experiences and impressions. I loved the experience of being on the farm as a child and bonding with the land and with nature. That was my first real experience with that. But I also learned that the American heartland at that time, this is 1981, this is the peak of tension with Iran around the U.S. hostage crisis at the embassy in Tehran. And here I am, a 6.5-year-old boy in southern Iowa, barely speaking English, and going to kindergarten, with kids who were hearing a lot of bigotry from their own parents about us. And so I picked that up at school. I became a target for that, as many people here understand. The name-calling, the stereotyping, the prejudice, and the physical hurt. I was beat up many times just for being who I was. There was one time where I was kicked in the you-know-where, and I bled urine for 2 days. As a boy, as a 6.5, maybe at that point 7-year-old boy. And it was a difficult and yet transformative experience for me, which obviously has carried me through my work today, and understanding the nature of the anger, the frustration that then turns into bigotry, prejudice, and hate in our society, and that is the fundamental root of why I do the work I do, is to create that change. From Iowa, we then went to LA. We went to East LA because we didn't have a lot of money. A friend of my father's arranged for us to rent an apartment for us in East LA. And that's where I lived until I was 16 years old. Made most of my closest friends, who are still my closest friends today, living there, and is where I first got involved in activism. So when I was 16 years old, in our local neighborhood, there was a toxic site next to a park. And it was a bit of a slope where the toxic site was slightly higher than the park, so the toxicities are leaking into the park. And of course, there are children and families praying in this park every day. So a group of residents started getting active around this to try to organize to, first of all, stop the toxic activities on the site and then get it cleaned up, get this to stop. And I got involved because it was close to my home, because I knew many of the residents involved. And through that experience, which we did eventually win, I got really turned on and excited about two things. One, getting active, getting involved, especially at the community level. It is so enriching to be involved with people of your own community, your own neighborhood, to do something together that ultimately becomes empowering. Whatever degree of success you achieve, the bond that creates is really special. But secondly, I learned about this idea of environmental justice, this movement of environmental justice. And I was fascinated by it for a few reasons. One, environmental justice characterizes itself as an outgrowth of the civil rights movement, that it is led and was created and led by people of color, organizing for their own rights when the mainstream white-led environmental movement, the traditional conservation-oriented white-led environmental movement and the Big 10 NGOs, we call them the Big 10 environmental NGOs, didn't see the environmental issues in communities of color as environmental issues. Didn't see those struggles as being part of their scope within their mission, organizational missions. And so this meant that communities had to fend for themselves and had to organize for themselves. And thus the environmental justice movement emerged out of that disparity and out of the civil rights movement. It was in the 1980s, the sort of next iteration of what civil rights in this country looked like, was about the right not only to have fair treatment in society, but to live in safe communities that did not make you sick, where you did not have to worry about your children developing asthma or cancer, or for adults to become infertile or to suffer birth defects because of these exposures, what we call cancer clusters. And of course, this is not a surprise to many of us, but when you lay over a map of where these toxicities and cancer clusters and high asthmatic rates tend to show up, those points lay right over where low-income communities are, where communities of color are. And so this is a consistent pattern that we've seen in our society. The struggle of the 1960s that Martin Luther King led continued in the 80s and continues today in many different forms. So another key thing that I was fascinated by and learned from in the environmental justice movement that I carried forward in my work from there was this environmental justice principle that those most affected by the issue, those communities most at the center of the struggle, must be at the forefront of the leadership of that struggle. It must be their voice that drives that change. And their insight and their understanding, the situational understanding of their experience, of their context, of their culture, and of their community needs and the political and economic realities that must be brought to the strategic table, essentially. And oftentimes, allies who are coming in to help with these struggles don't necessarily have that insight. And often when speaking for communities, are sending out a message, I believe sometimes a hurtful one, that those communities perhaps are not able to speak for themselves. And that's a very fundamental, I believe, disservice to the cause of social justice and the advancement of empowerment and self-determination in communities of color who are trying to establish their own base for change. This, for me, this particular principle and this insight into what social justice really is about has really influenced over my work the idea of what leadership is and what my role in it is. Particularly, I've come to understand that my role as a leader, fundamentally, is developing other leaders. That is the most important thing I can be doing, because in the context of social justice, we must all be able to make change. And particularly in those communities that I am in alliance with, it must be those communities that have the capacities, that have the opportunities, that have the access, and have the voice to advance the change agenda themselves. So the last piece for me in terms of my sort of trajectory of work, I was involved in the environmental justice movement basically until my mid-20s. I went to undergrad in Santa Cruz to get away from LA, and then from Santa Cruz moved to Oakland. While in Santa Cruz, I was coming up on the weekends volunteering as a community organizer with environmental justice organizations such as Communities for a Better Environment, Literacy for Environmental Justice, and Green Action. And I was involved in campaigns all throughout the Bay Area, in Baby's Hunter Point, East Palo Alto, in Richmond, in West Oakland, and East Oakland. And through that work, while we were working with residents, one of the things we kept hearing was, while environmental justice issues were a problem, while these toxic facilities and factories and communities were a huge issue, of course there were other issues that the community was struggling with, that the community wanted to see solution with. And we as a group of organizers appeared at least to have some resource that we could bring to bear in addressing other issues. And so a lot of residents gave us the feedback that they wanted to see the issue of food access addressed as well. They wanted to see the health problems that were coming out of the community, not only from environmental justice, but from a lack of access to fresh, healthy foods being addressed. And for us, in the environmental justice lens, where we were looking at community health in the broadest context possible, not just physical health, but the comprehensive vision of what community health looks like, that made sense for us. That was an obvious connection, partly because we realized in our research that there's a direct link between malnutrition and exposure and absorption of toxicities. The less, for example, in children, the less malnourished, or the more malnourished they are, the less resistant they are to lead exposure. Because lead is then interpreted by the body as a mineral and is bound to the body in place of calcium, where a child is lacking calcium. So there ends up being a direct connection between diet and the nutritional well-being of the individual and these broader toxic issues in neighborhoods that are faced with them. So from there, I began to make a change from the sort of traditional environmental justice view to what we now call food justice, to work on the access to food issue in neighborhoods like West Oakland. There are over 400 such communities in the United States that lack access to healthy, fresh foods, that are underserved by anywhere between 60 to 70% of their demand for shopping. My primary work is in West Oakland. That community is underserved by 70% of its demand for shopping. That means that residents have to leave the community to shop or rely on nearby corner stores, which of course are carrying mostly processed, poor quality foods and at very high prices. $40 million in West Oakland's food spending power is leaking out of the community every single year. So this also has a really significant economic impact. What we call the multiplier effect. The recirculation of local spending is not taking place when 70% of that community is spending for just food. And this, of course, doesn't represent any other category of spending in goods and services for this community. When that is leaking out of the neighborhood, the job creation potential is lost, the tax revenue potential is lost, the multiplier effect for local economic development is lost. So we saw those intersections between health, economic development, and social justice, and coined it food justice to build on the legacy of environmental justice and bring the same lens, the same analysis to the problem, which first and foremost articulates that it is inequity and social injustice and racism that are at the foundation of the problem, and that those issues are systemic in nature, that they're not interpersonal, that they're fundamentally structural in the way our society works. And so we wanted to bring that, and we wanted to bring this environmental justice principle of community leadership in creating People's Grocery and driving forward in the strategies and projects that we would develop over time. So we co-founded it in 2002, myself and 2 other residents of West Oakland. And our basic vision was to open a grocery store. That we would open this amazing grocery store that, on the one hand, served the local need for access to fresh, healthy foods at affordable prices and created jobs and tax revenues, but on the other could act as a hub for social gathering, for convening, for strategizing. And we took this idea and the name People's Grocery from a similar effort in the 1880s and 1890s in Memphis, Tennessee, by 3 African-American men who started a grocery business there called the People's Grocery Company. Those 3 gentlemen were extraordinarily successful at the grocery business. Prior to them The only grocery stores around were white-owned, and during Jim Crow segregation, of course, for African Americans to shop at a white-owned grocery store meant, at minimum, getting bad service. It often meant getting priced unfairly, and it also meant their spending power was going to a portion of their region that was racist against them, that did not have their best interests in mind. And so these three men saw an opportunity to begin to shift the social and economic foundation of the African American community in Tennessee towards its own betterment. By beginning with the simple idea of opening a grocery store. That grocery store then evolved to become an important center of organizing in the community, where after hours, residents were gathering in the grocery store to talk about how they were going to organize to advance their own cause for equity, equality, social justice in their town. And it was an extraordinary model and example of how community businesses can become part of the fabric of a social justice movement, that we can show up as social change agents in many different ways, not just the sort of traditional service provider or organizer, but even as entrepreneurs. We can play a role in creating change. And these gentlemen obviously demonstrated that. The tragic and I think predictable ending was that because they threatened the white establishment in Tennessee, ultimately they were framed, accused of a rape, thrown in jail, their store was burned to the ground, and the following day they were lynched. We took that story as an understanding of the actual power that organizing with our communities, both socially and economically, can present in creating meaningful change, and that it can become, at times, a threat to those who have a different interest. So People's Grocery went forward with this idea that a grocery store could also act as a community hub. What we learned, however, as we researched the business is we had absolutely no idea how to run a grocery store whatsoever. We were community organizers by background and training, and so the idea of running a very difficult, competitive business was a risk for us. So we decided to develop a number of smaller scale projects in a nonprofit context that over time could address the local need while providing us with that experience and that knowledge necessary to eventually open a grocery store. And so that's the trajectory of People's Grocery. I left the nonprofit a year and a half ago after we felt that we had come full circle to begin working on opening the retail business, which we're calling People's Community Market, and is a spin-off for-profit sister. And I don't think I have time to get into the details about that, but that's the basic background of my work and where I've come to. Now I want to make a few important points about what I've experienced and learned as a leader of an organization in a community of color working for social change and social justice. One that I think is really important in this context where I realized that my role as a leader was developing other leaders. One thing that presented for me was that I needed to think about and understand leadership differently than perhaps the conventional notion of leadership being based on technical, managerial, and organizational skills. Those are vital, especially if you're developing an organization. It's important to know how to manage people. It's important to know how to raise funding and things like that, how to create an effective organization. However, in marginalized communities, there are other skill sets that are essential, equally essential and vital to achieving success and moving forward the mission of an organization. And those can be soft skills, cultural skills, the ability to access the existing social networks that are in these neighborhoods, networks that were often how communities, especially under oppressive segregation times, is how they actually got things done, how they lived, how they survived. To bring the social capital, to bring unique insight into the problem, into the circumstances of need. The creativity and idea that can only come from living in the experience itself was very fundamental in our understanding of how we're going to craft the best solutions to the problems. And so as we began to think about leadership, we had to develop what I call an asset-based approach, which was first and foremost beginning in thinking about leadership by honoring and recognizing and building on top of the existing resources, talents, and assets that are already in the community, that are already among the individuals that are there, because they can bring so much more to pass and for those organizations to be much more effective. And oftentimes I do see nonprofit organizations, particularly social service organizations, in low-income neighborhoods that are not really coming from this principle. and are tending to hire practitioners from the outside to come in and solve problems. And after decades and decades of banging their head against the wall and not only seeing a lack of improvement, but a sliding back in change, where hunger is greater than it was when they began, and homelessness is greater, and poverty is greater, and they're saying, what's wrong? Why can't we solve the problem? Well, obviously, one is that it takes a long time to address any complex social problem. Two, any complex social problem is complex and takes tremendous effort to figure out where the right lever is. But three, the lack of forefront, high-level community leadership to provide the voice and the insight is a missing asset that, I believe, in many ways hurts these organizations' ability to identify the best strategic path to move forward. So we had to really think about that, and in doing that, we also had to sort of redefine what the criteria of leadership was for us as an organization. When we were looking for leaders to join our organization, for staff members, for teen interns, for board members, we had to be careful to not only look at the sort of resume list of skills, criteria, and qualification, but the cultural and community and soft skill base of what an individual brought to pass. Because often it wasn't about the technical skills. The technical skills can be taught. They can be taught. They can be trained. But the soft skills, to be able to have credibility and trust in a community, to speak that language, to be part of that network, you can't train that. You can't create that. That comes inherently as who you are as an individual. So we had to sort of redefine the way that we understood leadership. And that sometimes resulted in bringing leaders in that were unsuspected leaders, unsuspected candidates. They were often a surprise, especially to, for example, our funders on the outside, who were expecting perhaps the more sort of traditional, conventional leader coming in. Would learn that we hired a resident that maybe had never even led an organization before, or even worked in a nonprofit before, maybe didn't have much job history, maybe didn't have the opportunity for higher education. And we had to make the case for why this was the right choice for us and the most effective form of leadership that we felt was necessary for our organization. When I was going through my transition at People's Grocery to People's Community Market, after having been the executive director for 8 years, we had a moment where we had to come back to this core understanding. We had a committee at the board level that was doing the recruitment for the new executive director. And initially that board was looking at more traditional skill sets. Partly out of the insecurity that I, as the founder, was leaving. They needed someone who was strong in management, someone who was strong in fundraising, someone who was strong in nonprofit administration and operations. What happened from there, and I wasn't involved in the committee in the initial rounds of interviews, but I did attend the sort of late stage interviews, was that all the final candidates were essentially outside practitioners and bureaucrats from my perspective. They brought great resume skills. They all had master's degrees and PhDs even, and they had led organizations, and some had raised millions of dollars. But none of them actually came from communities like West Oakland. They didn't really understand the issues, the needs, the opportunities, how to really work in those communities. So I had to sort of intervene with the board and bring us back to this fundamental understanding that if we hired someone like that, we might succeed philanthropically. We might succeed in the PR world, but we were not necessarily going to succeed at the community level. And that's where we needed to be succeeding, because People's Grocery was fundamentally a community-based organization, and our greatest asset was our trust, our reputation, and our relationships in the community. And we needed a leader who could strengthen and steward those assets more than any other set. And so we shifted, and we were very successful in the end at hiring Nikki Henderson, formerly from Green for All, as the new executive director, a young African-American woman who for the last year and a half has blown away my legacy at that organization and is taking it to completely new heights than I had ever even dreamed of. So that's a very, I think, important experience that I had in grounding this understanding even further. Another point I want to make about the context of leadership is in social justice is that the social justice organization itself cannot be using what I call the narrative of the needy, which ties in with this notion of asset-based leadership. The narrative of the needy is the common sort of social service charity narrative that says that people are in need of help and service by others, and thus charities must come in and provide them with service. There are a few problems with that. One is that it doesn't build capacity in the community to solve the problems itself. And what I'm more interested in the relationship between a community and an organization is a partnership where the community is able to solve the problems itself with the support and allyship of organizations. The narrative of the needy tends to discount those assets that the recipients bring to the table themselves, and thus never actually asks them, what do you see as the solution to the problem? And what this also does is it tends to really overlook the opportunity for example, in ending hunger, to address the more fundamental root cause of the issue. In understanding how did someone come to be hungry? What we see at the surface level is many great social organizations, food banks, are fighting tooth and nail to reduce hunger in this country as it's skyrocketing during our economic recession. But they're not necessarily looking at the root cause of what's creating that hunger, and that's often because they're not asking the right questions and they're not engaging their base to derive the wisdom, the intelligence, and the insight from them, and thus tend to miss the mark. So I think that's a very important point as we all look at what our service roles are in this world. Social change is not social service. That addressing symptoms is not addressing root causes. That charity and justice are not necessarily the same things. And so as you go forward to think about what role do you want to have in creating change in the world, I encourage you to think about not only a form of leadership that is broad-spread and empowering, but is able to get at the more fundamental substantive issues of what we struggle with. What you see in the Occupy protests now is the frustration of what we are beginning to understand are the root causes of this recession, which are not really about what's happening on the stock market or what's happening between government loans to banks or what's happening in the EU. It's fundamentally about the dramatic inequities and disparities between those who wield power and wealth in our societies and the masses of us who don't. That those in power are simply attending to their own interests, as it has always been the case from the beginning of the theft of indigenous lands in this country to the enslavement of Africans. The people in power have attended to their own base building of power and wealth. And we are reaching a point, I believe, where we have become tired, frustrated, and disillusioned with the idea that the powerful are our leaders and that the powerful can solve our problems. So one last comment that I want to make is that leadership is, I believe, most fundamentally about relationships. It's not about how smart you are, how good you speak, what kind of strategies you develop, how much money you can raise, any of that. It is most importantly about the relationships you can cultivate with individuals. That it is really about being able, as a leader, to be focused on caring, on being a human being, and on being emotionally available and open. And I don't mean to get too new age and flowery here, but that is a fundamental. If you are looking to rally people for a cause, to bring their greatest passion and energy and loyalty to that cause, then they have to be seen as human beings and have to be cared about by their leaders. And that means that a leader has to spend a lot of time, and I would argue a majority of their time, building relationships and developing people. When I was first the executive director at People's Grocery, I wasn't doing this. I was paying too much attention to the fundraising, the administration, the systems. And I wasn't spending enough time with our community, with our staff, with our interns. And it brought a lot of problems and a lot of struggles. And I got some good advice and mentorship, particularly from Van Jones, formerly Bella Baker Center, and Green for All, that I needed to put a lot more time into my people, that I just needed to sit down and talk with them, that I needed to learn their stories, that I needed to ask them questions, that I needed to show that I cared and wanted to know who they're about. Because when I begin to listen, and that's a key skill set in leadership, when I begin to listen and I begin to show that I care about what they care about, that caring becomes the fuel for driving the organization forward. And as I began to do that, the organization's effectiveness, as well as sort of general positive atmosphere and happiness internally, changed dramatically. And so that's very important because I think oftentimes we forget sometimes in our leadership roles, especially when we're busy, to just be human and to focus on the relationship and to take the time to listen, to talk, to ask questions, and to show that caring. And I believe fundamentally that is the most important attribute of a leader. If you cannot do that, but you have a great resume or list of accomplishments, it's hard for me to assess you as the most effective leader, because where is the base behind you? Who is following you? Who's creating that change? And so that, I think, is the final message I want to leave with you, is that this is not just a group of isolated individuals. This is a network of individuals coming together to create change, and we each have a unique story. We each have passion. That passion may come from a different place, a different experience, a different reason for why we have it, the sense of injustice we have each individually experienced. But it's brought us all here right now on this lazy gray Sunday morning. And it's only in the relationships between us that we can continue that work individually and collectively. And so I encourage you today to not just attend the workshops, not just listen to the speakers, but really spend the time with each other, talking about what do you each care about? What matters to you? Why are you here? What's your personal story that brought you to this table? Where's that pain in your heart that fired you up to want to make change in the world? Because that is how we as human beings will create change in the human context of the world we live in. So I think time is to wrap up on my portion of the talk. We have maybe, how long do we have for Q&A? Oh, very quick. Okay, so we're just going to have maybe one question, if there's any burning question. No? Was I that bad? Really? Man. See, I told you the bar was high. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering what you think about the occupation movement and how we can better integrate sustainability into our message, because right now we don't have necessarily a clear message, but we definitely don't have sustainable practices being encouraged in the media.
And what do you mean by sustainable exactly?
Like environmental sustainability.
Environmental sustainability, yeah. Well, I think it's tough, because the Occupy movement is already struggling to find its message, and particularly to find a focus, right? Because we are in such complex times and we're experiencing so many complex problems. A lot of people who are showing up for different reasons. They have a different agenda, have a different set of issues that matter to them. For one, it might be the corruption of banks. For the other, it might be the political crisis. For another, it might be about specific issues, immigration, prison systems, poverty, all these different things. So first of all, finding a common platform is a challenge. And then within that, what's the scope of the demand? I think particularly in left and progressive circles, we tend to lay on everything we want at once. I want this, and I want this, and we're going to change this, and here's my demands. And as a result, we lose the focus. We diffuse the possibility, because the reality is that in this world, we do have to compromise some. And in order to achieve successful compromise, we have to have specific asks to get there, and sometimes incremental asks, right? We want this now. Okay, we got that. What's next that we can work towards? And so I think a lot of the anger we're seeing right now is more about the social and the economic issues than the environmental. It's impossible at the end of the day to strip them out and separate them. All right, the system is whole in terms of its impact on people and planet. Yet at the same time, I think many are thinking about how do we focus this? And I think that because the more immediate struggle is the concern for jobs, the concern for economic well-being, for communities to simply be able to maintain themselves, sometimes when that fear sets in, the environment tends to take a back seat. And I'm not saying that's right, but that's the human reality, is we close in on what's the most immediate of concern to us. So I think that we do have to think see this movement as a long-term arc of change. And if we can do that, and with this expansiveness, then it's okay to have a longer-term agenda where there are phases in what we want to see changed, instead of trying to pile it all at the front end because we feel urgent or that the time is going to run out, that the window of opportunity is going to close. So I think we need to just be very long-term and patient about the kind of changes we're going for. All right, so thank you very much. I really appreciate you all being here and for listening to me today.